St. Anselm was the most creative Christian philosopher in the 11th century, and his most famous work is the Proslogion, which means discourse in Latin. The title refers to the imagined discourse between Anselm and an atheist. Our textbook presents about half of the Proslogion. The goal of the Proslogion is to present as simple an argument as possible that proves the existence of God. Of the topics covered in this lecture, the most important is from chapter 2 of the Proslogion. This brief chapter contains the entirety of Anselm's ontological argument for God's existence. Anselm lived an eventful life despite only gaining notoriety relatively late in his life. Anselm was born in present-day Italy and educated at a French monastery. He ended up in England due in part to the Norman conquest of 1066. Normandy is a region of present-day France. Although he became archbishop at the age of 60, in the hopes that he would be easily controlled, Anselm ended up being a spirited leader of the English church. He was so willing to oppose the royalty that he was exiled twice from England. There are a couple things to keep in mind regarding the general intellectual and cultural background of Anselm's work. First, philosophy in the European Middle Ages was tightly intertwined with the Christian church. It was assumed that part of philosophy's task was to prove the existence of God. Anselm and Aquinas are the two most important figures of medieval philosophy, with Descartes marking the transition to modern philosophy. Second, even though our book labels the Anselm chapter as the Ontological Argument, Anselm himself did not use this label. The label was not created until the 1700s by Immanuel Kant. The ontological argument refers to a general approach to proving God's existence. An ontological argument attempts to prove God's existence without depending on any observations gained through experience of the natural world. For Anselm and Descartes, this means that understanding the nature of reason can reveal the divine nature of God. Ontological arguments have a long history in philosophy, partly because of how controversial they are. Bertrand Russell noted that it's easy to be unsatisfied with ontological arguments, but very difficult to explain what is wrong with them. Let's now turn to the Proslogion, which begins with Anselm discussing the relationship between faith and reason. In the first chapter, Anselm explicitly tells us that faith is more important than reason. Anselm writes, quote, "Rather than seeking to understand so that I can believe, I believe so that I can understand." End quote. In other words, belief comes first, understanding second. Even though Anselm prioritizes faith, he is optimistic about reason's ability to strengthen faith. Anselm thinks he can give a rational proof for God's existence, a proof that might even persuade some atheists. In the opening of chapter 2, Anselm quotes from Psalm 14, "The fool hath said to his heart that there is no God." In other words, Anselm acknowledges that there are people who sincerely believe that God does not exist. This transitions into Anselm's ontological argument. Anselm's ontological argument is very short. This is because the argument is only meant to clarify what the concept of God already implies. The first step of the ontological argument is to contemplate the idea of God. Even the atheist can think about the idea of God. Anselm has defined God as, quote, "something than which nothing greater can be conceived," end quote. So the atheist only needs to think about this concept, namely, that which nothing greater can be thought of. Now, if we're able to think of an idea, we can also imagine what it would be like for the idea to exist outside of our minds. This is the second step of the argument. Consider unicorns. You can entertain the idea of a unicorn, and rather than just imagining a cartoon unicorn, you can also imagine what it would mean for a unicorn to actually exist in the real world. It would be like a horse prancing around with a horn on its head. The third step of Anselm's argument asks which of those two ideas are greater. Isn't the second idea greater, the idea of the thing that actually exists? What's Anselm's reasoning here? Consider any good thing in your life. Let's say you like dogs. That dog brings you many good experiences. Wouldn't the goodness the dog brings you be even greater if the dog continued to exist? Furthermore, wouldn't the goodness be even greater if the dog had always existed? It's difficult to imagine an eternal dog, but Anselm's point is that with any good that we can experience in our daily lives, it would be a greater amount of that good if it existed longer. Back to the third step of Anselm's argument, this is why the idea that we imagine to exist in reality is greater than the idea that we only imagine to exist in our mind. Notice what happens, Anselm argues, if you continue to insist that God does not exist. As already discussed, God has been defined as that which nothing greater can be thought of. But the atheists in the previous step agree that the idea of the greatest being actually existing in reality is greater than that idea only existing in one's mind. Hence, it would be a contradiction to claim that the thought only exists in your mind, because this idea would not be that which nothing greater can be conceived. According to Anselm, the only way out of this contradiction is to accept that the concept actually exists. In other words, that which nothing greater can be thought of necessarily exists, otherwise it would be possible to think of something greater than it. Thus, God exists. Anselm's ontological argument was met with immediate criticism, including from other Christian philosophers. In the final part of the lecture, we will examine one of the most famous objections in Anselm's own day, as well as how Anselm can explain atheists' belief. The most famous objection during Anselm's lifetime came from a monk named Guanilo. While this isn't included in our textbook selection, I wanted to briefly touch on Guanilo's objection. Guanilo attempts to show that Anselm's argument is invalid. Guanilo thinks that we can accept the truth of the argument's premises while reaching an obviously false conclusion. To demonstrate this, Guanilo creates a counterexample. He asks us to consider a perfect island, that is, the island of which a greater cannot be thought. We can entertain this idea in our minds, but if it only exists in our minds, it would be less great than if the island also existed in reality. Guanilo believes that according to the reasoning of Anselm's argument, this perfect island must exist. But this is obviously false. There is no logical necessity that implies the existence of a perfect island. As a result, Guanilo concludes that Anselm's reasoning is flawed. Anselm's response is that the ontological argument only works for the greatest being. God is the only being that necessarily exists. As we will see in the next lecture, Aquinas agrees that God is the only being that necessarily exists, but, like Guanilo, disagrees with Anselm's argument. The fourth chapter of Anselm's Proslogion addresses the fact that some people will remain unpersuaded by the argument. How can this be if the very idea of God implies God's existence? Anselm distinguishes between two ways of thinking an idea. In the first way, you merely think of the words that signify something. This would be like reading a word for an emotion, like joy, and not being able to relate it to a personal experience in your life. The second general way of thinking an idea is to understand what the thing itself is. Someone who remains an atheist, Anselm argues, has only thought of God in the first sense without achieving the second step. In other words, the atheist fails to fully understand the concept of that which nothing greater can be thought of.